The Sea Pearl, an upscale seafood restaurant in the heart of downtown Boston, was alive with the energy of a bustling Friday night. Beneath the soft golden glow of chandelier lights, elegantly dressed patrons clinked their wine glasses, engaged in lively conversation. The crisp scent of freshly grilled lobster and buttered scallops filled the air, mingling with the distant hum of jazz drifting from the grand piano in the corner. Waiters, clad in pristine black and white uniforms, weaved gracefully through the crowded dining area, balancing trays of oysters on ice, steaming bowls of clam chowder, and aged bottles of Chardonnay. The atmosphere was intoxicating, sophisticated yet vibrant, a perfect meeting ground for the city's elite. At the center of it all sat Richard Lawson, a man who commanded attention without asking for it. With his slicked-back silver hair, sharp navy suit tailored to perfection, and a Rolex that glistened under the restaurant's soft lighting, he exuded an aura of power and privilege. Richard wasn't just any businessman, he was one of Boston's most formidable real estate moguls, a man whose name alone could turn a handshake into a million-dollar deal. Tonight, he held court at an exclusive corner table, surrounded by his closest business associates. They laughed at his jokes, nodded at his stories, and hung on his every word. For Richard, these dinners were more than social gatherings, they were performances, carefully choreographed to reinforce his dominance. And tonight, as he swirled his glass of Merlot and leaned back in his chair, he knew he had the audience right where he wanted them. "And so I told the guy," Richard boomed, his voice cutting through the restaurant's ambient noise, "if you want the penthouse, you're gonna have to play by my rules. Otherwise, I've got 10 other buyers who'd kill for it." His companions erupted into laughter, their reactions exaggerated, eager to please. The waiter, a young man in his early 20s, approached with a nervous smile. "Mr. Lawson, your main course will be right out. Can I get you another drink?" Richard barely looked at him, instead waving his hand dismissively. "You should already know the answer to that," he scoffed. The waiter swallowed hard and hurried away. His tablemates exchanged amused glances. "You really don't take no for an answer, do you?" one of them quipped. Richard smirked, taking another sip of his wine. "That's why I win." The conversation shifted to the latest real estate acquisitions, inflated property values, and the art of outmaneuvering competitors. It was all a game to Richard, a game he had mastered. But as the night carried on, the energy in the restaurant subtly shifted. Unbeknownst to Richard, an unexpected turn of events was about to unfold, one that would challenge his arrogance and redefine his understanding of power. For now, though, he remained blissfully unaware, basking in his own self-importance, oblivious to the lesson that fate had in store for him. At first glance, Daniel Foster looked like any other waiter rushing between tables at the Sea Pearl, seamlessly balancing plates of seafood and trays of crystal-clear wine glasses. He moved with purpose, his posture straight, his uniform crisp, his presence a quiet contrast to the boisterous energy of the Friday night crowd. But a closer look revealed the subtle details that set him apart. The way his left hand bore the brunt of his work, the faint metallic glint of his prosthetic as it peeked from beneath his neatly pressed sleeve. At 40 years old, Daniel was no stranger to hard work. Once, he had worn a very different uniform, the navy blue of the United States Navy. He had served with pride, dedicating nearly 2 decades of his life to his country. But war had a way of taking as much as it gave. 7 years ago, during a classified mission overseas, an explosion had changed everything. He had been one of the lucky ones, he had survived. But survival had come at a cost. His right hand, once steady and precise, had been taken from him in an instant, replaced by the cold efficiency of a prosthetic limb. The transition to civilian life had been anything but easy. The medals, the folded flag, the government-issued reassurances, they were small comforts against the brutal reality of starting over. Employers saw the prosthetic before they saw the man. Opportunities were scarce. The world had moved on without him. But Daniel Foster was not the type to give up. He had a family to support, a wife who had stood by his side through it all, and 2 young children who depended on him. So when a friend mentioned a job opening at the Sea Pearl, he had taken it, grateful for the chance to work, no matter the challenges. The job wasn't easy. The fast pace, the endless demands, the occasional customers who stared too long at his hand or flinched when he reached to pour their wine. But Daniel took it all in stride. He adapted, learning to move with precision, relying on muscle memory to balance trays, mastering the fine art of making his prosthetic feel almost invisible. And when exhaustion threatened to weigh him down, he thought of his family, the laughter of his children, the warmth of his wife's embrace, the life he was building for them. That was all the motivation he needed. Tonight was no different. Another shift, another night spent navigating the demands of Boston's elite. And at the center of it all sat Richard Lawson, a man whose arrogance radiated across the room. Daniel had served men like him before, entitled, dismissive, seeing the people around them as nothing more than tools to serve their needs. But Daniel had learned long ago that true power wasn't measured in wealth or status. As he approached Lawson's table, tray in hand, he had no way of knowing that this night would be different. That tonight, fate had something unexpected in store for them both. Richard Lawson leaned back in his chair, swirling the last remnants of his Merlot in its crystal glass. The night had been entertaining, good food, expensive wine, and a captive audience hanging on his every word. But as he reached for the bottle to pour himself another drink, his eyes landed on Daniel Foster, the waiter who had just set a fresh dish of oysters before him. Something about the man caught his attention. The way he moved, competent, efficient, but slightly offbeat. Then Richard saw it. The prosthetic hand, glinting subtly under the restaurant's warm lights as Daniel adjusted a plate. A slow smirk curled on Richard's lips. This was too good to ignore. Well, well, he mused, his voice dripping with amusement. Didn't notice that before. He lifted his glass toward Daniel, as if making a toast. Lost it in a bar fight, did you? The table chuckled, some of his associates shifting uncomfortably. Daniel remained calm, his expression unreadable. No, sir, he said evenly. Lost it in the service. Richard's smirk widened. A veteran. Even better. Oh, of course. Serving the good ol' US of A. So what's a war hero like you doing serving plates in a restaurant like this? You dreaming of bigger things? Or is this about as good as it gets? A few of the men at the table laughed, but Daniel didn't flinch. I do what I need to provide for my family, he replied, keeping his voice measured. Richard clicked his tongue, shaking his head in mock sympathy. Shame. A man like you must have had dreams before, huh? He tilted his head, eyes gleaming with mischief. Come on, humor me. What did you want to be before life had other plans? Daniel hesitated, then answered, I used to play the piano. For a moment, there was silence. Then Richard burst into laughter, loud and sharp, cutting through the restaurant's chatter. Some of the other guests turned to glance at the scene. You? A pianist? Richard scoffed. He gestured toward Daniel's prosthetic. And what? You play one-handed now. Must be quite the show. Daniel held his ground, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Richard leaned forward, sensing an opportunity to turn the moment into a spectacle. He waved toward the grand piano at the corner of the restaurant, where a hired musician was taking a break. Tell you what, hero, he said, voice brimming with condescension. Why don't you give us all a little performance? Show us what a one-handed pianist can do. His tablemates chuckled, some nudging each other, waiting for Daniel to shrink away in embarrassment. But Daniel didn't move. His eyes flickered toward the piano, then back to Richard. For a split second, something changed in the air. Then, slowly, Daniel set down his tray, and without a word, he walked toward the piano. A heavy silence hung in the air as Daniel Foster made his way toward the grand piano. The polished black surface gleamed under the restaurant's soft lighting, an elegant centerpiece of the room. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, Richard's smug amusement, the curious glances of other diners, the whispered speculations. He knew what they expected. A spectacle. A failure. A moment they could laugh about over expensive drinks. For a brief second, doubt flickered in his mind. It had been years since he had touched a piano. Not since before the war. Not since before he had lost a part of himself. He hesitated, standing before the instrument, his reflection staring back at him from the glossy lid. Then he exhaled slowly. No, this wasn't about proving anything to Richard Lawson. This was for himself. Daniel sat down, adjusting his posture as his left hand hovered above the keys. His prosthetic rested at his side, unmoving. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then, he began to play. The first notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata drifted through the restaurant's soft, deliberate, hauntingly beautiful. The gentle, melancholic arpeggios whispered through the air, carrying a depth of emotion that words could never capture. The lively chatter around the restaurant slowly faded, replaced by something more powerful: captivation. At Richard's table, the smug grins vanished, replaced by silent disbelief. Richard leaned forward slightly, his amusement faltering as he watched the waiter he had mocked just moments ago become something entirely different before his eyes. Daniel's fingers moved effortlessly across the keys, his left hand weaving the melody with stunning precision, his body swaying subtly with the rhythm. He didn't just play, he felt every note, every rise and fall, every heartbeat of the piece. The prosthetic at his side no longer mattered. The limitations they had expected to define him had vanished, overshadowed by sheer passion and skill. As the music swelled, the transformation was undeniable. The audience was no longer watching a waiter, they were witnessing an artist. Conversations had stopped. Glasses remained untouched. Even the waitstaff had paused in their tracks, drawn in by the unexpected beauty of the moment. The melody deepened, each note a whisper of his past: the boy who had fallen in love with music, the young man who had left it behind for duty, the soldier who had lost more than just his hand, and the survivor who had fought to find himself again. By the time he reached the final notes, the restaurant was completely silent. The last chord lingered in the air like an echo, like a breath that no one dared release. And then applause. It started slow, hesitant. Then it grew, sweeping across the room in waves. Diners rose to their feet. Some clapped. Some simply stared in awe. But at the center of it all sat Richard Lawson, frozen in his chair, speechless for the first time that night. The final notes of Moonlight Sonata faded into the air like a lingering whisper, stretching the silence in the room for just a moment longer. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the restaurant erupted into applause. The sound was thunderous, sweeping through the space like a rising tide. Diners rose to their feet, some clapping, some shaking their heads in astonishment. A few even wiped away tears, moved by the unexpected beauty of the performance. At his table, Richard Lawson sat frozen, his once smug expression now replaced by something far less familiar: quiet humility. He had expected a joke, a stumbling embarrassment, a moment of failure he could laugh about later. But instead, he had witnessed something undeniable. He had seen a man, one he had dismissed with nothing more than a condescending remark, transform into something greater than he had imagined possible. The music hadn't just been good, it had been masterful, passionate, unforgettable. The laughter he had expected had never come. Instead, he was the one left feeling small. Daniel Foster, the man he had so casually ridiculed, had just commanded the attention of an entire room, not with arrogance, not with wealth, but with raw, undeniable talent. As the applause continued, Daniel simply stood from the piano bench, adjusted his uniform, and walked back toward the waitstaff station. There was no bow, no self-congratulatory smile. He had nothing to prove. Richard watched as Daniel picked up his tray, as if nothing had happened at all. He went back to work, calmly refilling a water glass at a nearby table, exchanging a polite smile with another guest. No fanfare, no acknowledgement of the stunned faces around him. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt something unfamiliar: discomfort. He had built his life on the belief that power came from dominance, from forcing others to acknowledge his superiority. But tonight, Daniel had done something Richard never could: earn the respect of a room without demanding it. As Daniel passed by Richard's table, their eyes met for the briefest moment. Richard opened his mouth to say something: a joke, an excuse, anything to salvage his pride, but the words never came. Daniel's expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something subtle yet piercing. Not anger, not satisfaction, just clarity. A quiet understanding that Richard, for all his wealth and status, had just been taught a lesson. Daniel didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply gave Richard a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, of quiet finality before turning away, continuing his work as if nothing had changed. But Richard knew better. Something had changed. For the first time in his life, he had been humbled, and as the applause finally began to die down, as conversations resumed and the restaurant returned to its usual lively rhythm, Richard sat in silence, his drink untouched, his laughter gone. Because no matter how much he tried to shake it, one undeniable truth remained. Tonight, the most powerful man in the room had never been him. The next morning, Daniel Foster arrived at the Sea Pearl for what he assumed would be a typical shift. He walked through the employee entrance, adjusted his uniform, and prepared himself for another long day of balancing trays and navigating the demands of Boston's elite. But as soon as he stepped inside, the atmosphere felt different. The staff exchanged glances as he passed. Some smiled knowingly. Others murmured in hushed voices, sneaking glances at him like he had somehow transformed overnight. Before he could make sense of it, his manager, Mr. Reynolds, approached him with an unreadable expression. "Daniel," Reynolds said, folding his arms, "come with me. There's someone who wants to talk to you." Daniel followed, confused but compliant. He was led into a small office at the back of the restaurant, where a distinguished-looking man in his 50s sat waiting. Dressed in a tailored blazer with silver-streaked hair and an air of quiet authority, the man studied Daniel with an intrigued smile. "Daniel Foster," he said, extending his hand. "My name is James Holloway. I'm a music producer from Los Angeles." Daniel hesitated, shaking his hand, still unsure what was happening. "I was here last night," Holloway continued. "I had dinner at the restaurant. I heard you play." He leaned forward slightly, eyes gleaming with something close to admiration. "And I haven't stopped thinking about it since." Daniel blinked, his brain struggling to catch up. "A music producer? From LA? I work with artists who break boundaries," Holloway went on. "And I run a project that spotlights adaptive musicians, people who refuse to let physical limitations stop them from creating art. I've spent years looking for talent that embodies that kind of resilience." He paused, then said, "I think you could be one of them." Daniel stared at him, his mind reeling. "I want to offer you a chance to record an album," Holloway said simply. "Not just as a pianist, but as a statement. A testament to the fact that music is bigger than circumstances. That it belongs to those who feel it, no matter what." Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He had spent years believing that chapter of his life was over, that his music had been buried in the past, left behind with the hand he had lost. But now, in the most unexpected way, it had found its way back to him. Holloway must have sensed his hesitation because he smiled. "I don't need an answer right now," he said, "but I think you already know what you want to do." He slid a business card across the table. "Call me when you're ready." Daniel stared at the card in his hands, his fingers running over the embossed letters. It felt real. It felt impossible. It felt like fate. As he left the office and stepped back into the restaurant, the weight of what had just happened settled over him. This was it, his second chance. And this time, he wasn't letting it slip away. For the first time in years, Daniel Foster embraced his future, proving that perseverance and passion could triumph over even the greatest adversity. In the end, Daniel Foster's story was never about proving someone else wrong. It was about proving to himself that his journey wasn't over. Life had thrown its share of challenges at him. He had lost something that once felt essential to his identity. He had faced the silent judgments, the lowered expectations, the quiet assumptions that he was somehow less than he once was. But through it all, he never lost the one thing that mattered most: his passion. That night at the Sea Pearl, when Daniel sat down at the piano, he wasn't just playing music, he was reclaiming a part of himself. He was showing the world, and more importantly, himself, that his ability had never been defined by what he lost. It had always been about what was within him: the dedication, the love for his craft, the unshakable will to keep going. And in doing so, he changed the way others saw him. Richard Lawson, a man who had built his success on power and control, had been humbled not by wealth or influence, but by the undeniable truth that real strength has nothing to do with status or dominance. It comes from perseverance, from refusing to let setbacks define you. It comes from standing tall, even when the world expects you to shrink. Daniel's story is a reminder to all of us that we are more than the obstacles we face. That no matter what life takes away, there is always something within us that cannot be diminished: our passion, our drive, our resilience. And perhaps most importantly, it's a lesson in never judging someone based on appearances or assumptions. Richard had looked at Daniel and seen only a waiter, not knowing that he was standing before a musician, a veteran, a man who had once risked everything in service of others. How often do we do the same? How often do we glance at a person and think we already know their story? How often do we assume limitations where there are none? This story is about overcoming adversity, but it's also about perspective. About looking beyond what's on the surface and recognizing that true greatness can come from anywhere, from the most unexpected places, from the most overlooked people. But now, it's your turn. We all have struggles. We all face challenges that threaten to hold us back. But like Daniel, we have the power to push forward, to redefine what's possible, to turn adversity into fuel for something greater. What is your passion? What is the thing that sets your soul on fire? And most importantly, what's stopping you from pursuing it? If Daniel's story has moved you, take this as your sign. Take that first step toward whatever dream you've been holding back from. Your story isn't over yet. And if you want to hear more stories of resilience, courage, and personal triumph, be sure to subscribe and join us as we share more inspiring journeys. Because sometimes the most powerful stories come from the most unexpected places.